I think building stuff in the cloud and owning the infrastructure just makes so much stuff like so much easier. And it's frankly just like from like a business model perspective, like so much easier because like there's such a precedent for like running things in the cloud and charging for it today.
Hi, you're listening to Scaling DevTools. Today we're joined by Erik Bernhardsson, who is the founder of Modal Labs. And Erik can correct me on this, but I think of Modal Labs as kind of like a Firebase or Vercel of doing stuff with data and LLMs. So you can't really run models in Firebase, and you can do it with Modal. That's how I think about it. Erik, do you want to jump in and give a better explanation?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, by the way. It's exciting to be on this
Thanks
podcast.
For joining.
Yeah, I think that's roughly right. Like we think of ourselves as a cloud tool or infrastructure provider for data teams and data products. We've seen a lot of usage within generative AI. So we focus a lot right now on people who want to run various types of models in the cloud and don't want to think about infrastructure. We also support all kinds of other stuff. So it ranges from like, running stable diffusion, text transcription, speech to text, text to speech, video processing, but also things like computational biotech. We have a few users doing that, or 3D rendering, web scraping. It's a fairly general purpose tool in that sense.
Yeah, and you've just like kind of rattled like quite a lot of different use cases there, and I can see that is it like the general theme is like if it's stuff that doesn't work well with like traditional kind of serverless stuff, or
yeah, exactly. I think we spend a lot of time on making serverless work for data, including building our entirely own proprietary infrastructure. So I think conceptually, like we're somewhat similar to AWS Lambda in a sense. Like you describe sort of a container and write the code yourself, and then we handle the scaling and resource management and provisioning and all that stuff. But very different in the sense that we focus a lot more on compute heavy jobs that typically require a lot of GPU or need to run for a very long time or have some other complex requirement on the environment.
Yeah. I can say for myself, I have been building something that does like video processing and does transcription and does like uses LLMs, and it's like so you kind of think that you can just go out and use like Heroku and you can just plug all these things together, but then suddenly you've got like big packages. You've got to store large files. You've got to, have these models, as you said, that take a long time. And it's just
CUDA driver versions.
Yes, exactly. and then, so I've been using AWS, and I have to learn EC2, how to use that, which is such a pain. And then it's expensive as well. And if you've got GPUs, you could be looking at $300, $400 a month, which you're not even using
more.
very much. Yeah, more. So yeah, I think this is a very big idea. And business.
I agree, but I'm biased.
So could you talk a bit about like how developers might, because I think this is going to become more and more common for developers. And could you talk a bit about like the developer workflow for people working with these kind of building these kind of projects that use LLMs and models and stuff?
Yeah, totally. So I started looking at this 3-4 years ago and started thinking a lot about like building better tools for data teams, and was actually somewhat agnostic as to like what we would build. I really just wanted to focus on making data teams more productive, because I noticed there's just a tool stack that's missing, I think, for them. Like they're running into a lot of like infrastructure problems and stuff. And started looking at like what are the things that like data teams that make their workflows unique. And some of the stuff, for instance, is like they tend to run a lot of things in production. They tend to run like more like non-standard like hardware, like GPUs. They tend to have like very bursty workloads, like fan out and like run things in parallel a lot, and like but also like there's some like simplifications. Like they almost always tend to use Python, for instance. So we decided we're just going to go all in on Python. So we decided to build this as like an end-to-end Python SDK. So unlike other frameworks, like Modal is not like an API. It's really just you're running code. And so the way you interact with Modal is like you describe your compute environment in code, and it's commingled with the app code itself. So basically, you can like define like, here's my machine learning model. I want to like run this, diffuser model or whatever, and here's the image definition, all in code. And that way, we have a command line interface where you can just like deploy that into the cloud, or just like run an ephemeral app. And the nice thing about Modal is we spend a lot of time on the container infrastructures and basically built our own file system with a bunch of other stuff. So, and what that enables us to do is we can take code on your computer and launch that in the cloud and execute it in basically a second in many cases, which to me is like what I wanted to build in the first place. Like I wanted to build something that feels exciting to use, like feels like I'm almost running things locally, right? Like that has this sort of same feedback loop. Because I think that's the key to developer productivity, is to have that like super fast feedback loop. And that's the thing you get with Modal, unlike many other infrastructure providers. Like you don't have to like build a container, push the container to the cloud, like run the, like you just like run the code almost as if you're running it locally, but it executes in the cloud. And it feels like it's executing locally still because it's so fast.
Yeah, that's huge. It's like just building containers takes ages with these sorts of projects, right? Alone.
Yeah, totally. And it's kind of annoying. Like, I mean, Docker, I think conceptually is a very cool tool. I always struggle because I find the command line interface super confusing. With Modal, you don't need to use Docker. Like we don't use Docker. In fact, like we don't, you don't need to install anything to use Modal. You just, do like, well, you have to install Modal, which is pip install Modal. And then you can immediately start running jobs in the cloud.
Yeah, your getting started guide is very fast. I went through that. It's like super quick.
Yeah. Yeah.
And could you tell us about like what kind of people are like adopting Modal, like, and why?
Yeah, it's been kind of a journey in itself. Like we actually, it's funny because like when I started building this, and I think still to some extent, my vision was always I want to build a general purpose tool. Like I want to build something that can run almost anything, like almost like a Kubernetes for data team, but in the cloud. So for a long time, I tried to sell this to like a lot of enterprise customers, and it's kind of a hard sales process because you're trying to convince them to like switch something out. And then about a year ago, we started seeing a lot of traction. Suddenly there was a lot of like new cool Gen AI models coming out. And a bunch of those people, were playing around with those models and trying to deploy them in Modal. And suddenly realized like, wow, there's a lot of people out there that want to run this stuff on Modal. Maybe we should focus on this use case. And so that's been like the vast majority of our growth in the last year or so has really been like enabling that new cohort of, in many cases, these are like traditional software engineers now coming into the data world, or people with like other different backgrounds. And a lot of those people, they're kind of starting from a clean slate. Like they don't have any infrastructure and they don't want to deal with all the traditional, setting up Kubernetes on AWS and all that stuff. Like they just want to run something and make it work. And so realize this is a great opportunity for us to offer a service that's much better than anyone else. So a lot of the usage we've seen so far tends to be, a lot of these Stable Diffusion, Dream Boost, ControlNet, some of these like, newer language models, like a lot of people doing fine tuning on Modal, like running their own fine tuning. We see a lot of audio actually, speech to text, text to speech. We see a lot of people using it actually for like music has been kind of an interesting use case, like a lot of like music generation. So there's some Gen AI algorithms for making music. It's kind of cool. And then more recently, we've seen a lot of video processing too, which is kind of exciting. I think there's a lot of like very interesting stuff where you kind of combine like sort of traditional like computer vision with like some of the new like Gen AI stuff. And there's some really cool applications that are running on Modal. Yeah,
that's really, really cool. And how would you say these people are like discovering Modal?
It's all inbound. Like, I mean, like I'm maybe trivializing a little bit. Like basically, like I think so far we spent almost nothing on like sales and marketing. But that being said, like I always had a presence on Twitter, for instance. I always been blogging, so I think a lot of people have been discovering it through that. Like I have a little bit of an audience that I've been trying to like leverage. So a lot of people, the typical, they come inbound and, but they probably heard us maybe on a podcast like this or saw my tweets or whatever. So I don't know. I think of myself as like half, social media intern, head of social media. Like I spend a lot of time just like talking about Modal and writing blog posts or whatever. And that, so I think that's like been the channel so far that's been driving most of the growth.
Yeah, that makes sense. When they come in, is it like, does there tend to be like a frustration that they are like kind of made them come and try out Modal? Because it can be scary sometimes to like change your workflow in a sense. Not scary, but like there's a resistance to try something new sometimes, unless there's like a real like pain.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in terms of like user adoption and like onboarding flow and like how people get started, like I don't know if like people come from like a position of like hating previous tools or just being curious about Modal in general. But like I spent most of my career on like consumer tools. So like I think for me, like thinking a lot about like bottoms up adoption felt more natural to me. And so I think Modal, conceptually is like kind of hard to explain what Modal does, I think, to a lot of people. So I always like feel like the best way to sell the value for Modal is to get people to try it. So a lot of like how I think about sort of acquisition and adoption is like, let's get people to the website and then let's get them to try Modal in like less than a few minutes, right? So we spend a lot of time like optimizing for that flow. Like how do you get people to install the app and then run some code in the cloud in just a couple of minutes? Like unlike a lot of traditional infrastructure setups, like there's actually a pretty complex configuration process in many traditional tools. But with Modal, it's like you just install a Python library, that's it. And that's very intentional because I think there's a lot of, like value in like feeling that magic. Like I think the product like ideally sells itself better. And especially since we're focusing so much on developer experience, I want to like make clear to users in a few minutes, like we're thinking about it differently. We were like you're running things in the cloud, like within a few minutes, like that is part of like why the product is so good. Like you can actually do that without any hassle. And also why I think, in general, like as I look at growth going forward, like we're always going to focus a lot on self-service and sort of bottoms up adoption. We've done like nothing top down so far. We'll obviously do that in the long run too. But bottoms up is where it's at right now. And that's why also I think a lot of our users skew, I would say like early stage, a lot of indie hackers, Series C startups and Series A startups. It tends to be like the sort of earlier part of the company journey. Starting to get some enterprise customers too, but it's sort of, that's more in the future.
Yeah. No, it makes sense to me why you're getting that kind of user. Totally. It's like, because they're otherwise forced to go and use like enterprise tools that just don't make sense for that.
Yeah, totally. And one of the things I realized is like, those are very different parts of the segment. Like if you look at like startups, like they often like start out on one side of that spectrum, right? Like, like we're focusing very much on bottoms up, focusing very much on like early stage customers. Many other, tools focus on the other side of the spectrum. Eventually we'll probably like, try to conquer the whole spectrum. But right now, like, our acquisition is very focused on this side of it, like early stage.
Yeah. And so it sounds like you've kind of found a really nice place, and it totally makes sense. What was it like when you got started? And maybe this is also, we didn't really introduce you, but for those listening, Erik is has had a very successful career, was like one of the early engineers at Spotify. I think was like the person that discovered that the freemium model actually works at Spotify.
That's somewhat exaggerated, but I did a lot of the early cohort analysis, and it was very exciting sort of like for me to understand like startup math and like, like really understand what makes a product like Spotify work on an economic, and the financial side. That was a sort of formative experience in my career.
Yeah. You were very humble as well. And then Erik was also a CTO with, I think you had like 300 engineers in your team for better.com.
Yeah, something like that, 300, 400, yeah.
So how was it going from like being the CTO and having 300 reports to just, going out and starting to, the early days before Modal was a thing? Like, how did you go from there to Modal?
It's like, I don't know, like I feel very good about like managing people, but also like having done that at large scale, like I managed like 300-400 people. Like the day I quit, I was just like, I just wanted to write code for like a year. And I kind of ended up, it was like so nice to just like, sit and just like crank out code again. Like I felt young, like I felt like, like reborn. now I'm managing a few people again. Like we're 14 people, and I have no qualms about like growing that team and like starting more like doing more like management again. But for at least for me, there was something very nice about going from like, and I've done that pendulum swing a few times in my career. Like I'm actually like pretty happy, like going in both directions. But at the time I started Modal, like I went in like full on like hacker mode for like 2 years. I'm like finally coming out of that cave.
Okay, and so how did you come out the cave? Was it did you try lots of other ideas before you landed on Modal?
Yeah, I had a few other ideas. Like I thought a lot about initially. I was like very interested in like web scraping about some prototypes, and I didn't really like feel like it was really exciting. And then like I started thinking about the data stack in general. And originally, I was actually thinking a lot about workflow scheduling because I have a background. I built a workflow scheduler back in like 2011, 2012 called Luigi that a bunch of people use. So it's been a space I've been like thinking about. Another space I always think about is vector databases. I built a vector database in 2012, and that's like kind of funny. It's like coming back. But yeah, I built the workflow schedulers. I thought a lot about like, maybe I should like turn that into a product. And then I was like, actually, like workflow scheduling is kind of annoying. It's like sort of hard to work with. And like, you really want to own the compute layer in order to like, for a lot of the data stack, like a lot of the foundational problems of the data stack, I think really, and what I realized is like really stems from like, on the compute layer, like being like hard to work with. So I stopped working on the workflow scheduler, still have the code somewhere actually. It's kind of fun prototype. But yeah, I started working on what's now Modal, like late 2020, early 2021. And pretty quickly realized like, this is what I wanted to do. That being said, I think a lot of the vision is very intact, but like, they're like, how I think about like use cases has completely shifted, right? Like I started building something that was, I thought it was like, this is going to be a replacement for Kubernetes. And then, like I mentioned, like we realized like, a year and a half in, like we barely had any users. I had a lot of confidence in the platform being useful for something, but it wasn't really clear, like what's the killer app here? And then all this like Gen AI stuff started happening. And so that was obviously a very kind of, serendipitous discovery that, was great for us. It would have been hard, like, I think we would have found something else eventually. But obviously very happy we have that sort of wedge like that, now there's like one place in the market where we have product market fit. Now the next challenge is like expanding that. So I think now, now that like growth is like starting to work, and I feel like the like core technology is like kind of we understand a little bit better. Kind of going back to your question, now it's like for me like, okay, let's come out of the cave. Let's like try to focus more on like user acquisition. Because I feel like basically the last 2.5 years I've been like deep in like, the rabbit hole, like building infrastructure. But yeah, now I'm ready to talk to customers.
And and actually, like that's kind of a question that people are like, you're kind of going after people working with LLMs, I guess, for customer acquisition, and like where do people building with LLMs like hang out and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would actually say like it's been less LLMs than I would say like other Gen AI. Like LLMs are very API driven, so a lot of people building on LLMs like. The money tends to all the money tends to go to like OpenAI in a sense. Like it's like less common that people run their own LLMs. We're starting to see a lot of people doing more like fine tuning, and especially there's some like interesting tools for like structured outputs. But to answer your questions, like where do they hang out? Like I don't know. Like I mean, that's Twitter, right? Like like. I think I'm in New York, so like I think San Francisco is probably a little bit more like a physical like scene. Like I get the feeling like people hang out actually in person and go to events and like talk all the time. There is a little bit of that in New York as well, but I think it's less pronounced. Like I think I don't know. Like the positive side of me says is because like people are so busy building, they don't have time to like go to these events. But I don't know. Like I'd imagine it'd be a very different sort of experience being in San Francisco, but New York's also a good place to be. And we're doing reasonably well, just like, finding people on Twitter, or like we have a Slack channel that people join, and sometimes like we start talking to people that way. And I think that's been the general experience, like, finding users.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know you've talked a lot about like developer experience and stuff. And have you had like any kind of process or like things that you would recommend that other people do to kind of ensure that it's a good experience for developers?
For their own, like you're talking about like DevTools founders?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a couple of like things I feel very strongly about, but I also like feel like it's like every product is like everything is like idiosyncratic. Like not everything translates, but like just to tell you like some of the things that I felt pretty strongly about is like one of the things is like I was always very adamant that I want to run everything in our cloud and like just build like a multi-tenant system and not compromise on that. Like who knows? Like maybe if someone in the future wants to pay us a lot of money to run it on-prem, like we'll maybe have that conversation. But I think building stuff in the cloud and owning the infrastructure just makes so much stuff like so much easier. Like you have full control of the infrastructure. You can upgrade the code whenever you want. And it's frankly just like from like a business model perspective, like so much easier because like there's such a precedent for like running things in the cloud and charging for it today. That people sort of understand like, okay, I'm paying for you to run this code in the cloud or running this product. So I think that's like one thing that I've personally like always been arguing for. Like you're always going to lose some customers that for security compliance reasons like can't run the thing in the cloud. I feel like we have the time on our side. Like I think every year like people get more and more warming up to the idea of like putting their stuff in someone else's environment. Starting with the cloud in 2008, like, but now also like with products like Snowflake or whatever. Some other things I spend a lot of time thinking about is like just the like, I mean, we talked about it, but like the onboarding flow, right? Like I think to me, like onboarding flow, a lot of like onboarding, like user acquisition, like the account creation feels like kind of jankily put together. To me, that's like the core product is the like, how do you get started, right? Like the core experience of the product is how easy is it to get set it up and launch this. Similarly, I would say about docs. Like I feel like a lot of products like completely mess up docs. Like they have this like amazing product, but then you go to the docs, like like one of the things I often do when I look at other developer tools is like I want to understand it, so I go to docs, and then there's this wall of text of like key concepts. We have a sprocket and a Bedonga and a Kukimuki and like what does it all do? Like how do I like combine it? Like just show me some code. Like how do I like build, So that's something where I feel like just, putting together a bunch of like like nice sort of like examples of like how do I get started? Like I want to take this code and I want to run it. It feels like such like a last mile thing that I notice a lot of dev tools that product, could really do much better.
Yeah. And I'm sure like everyone agrees with you in a sense that like these things, like if you said to any DevTools founder, like, do you care about docs? They're like, yeah, okay, docs are important. But then why do you think like some of them, when you go there and it's like, as you said, there's just like, there's a wall of text, they're telling you loads of like made up words that mean something in their tool. Why do you think that's like so common?
I feel like sometimes like, I don't know if this is necessarily true, but like one model of this that I have is that I think people approach like docs as like they approach code, which is like when you like write code, you take your thing and you break it down into like, like things that a computer understands. So that's why like you end up with this like key concepts. You have to write this YAML. You have to do this. Like, but like you're not writing for a computer. You're not telling a computer what to do, right? And when you're like explaining, when you're talking to a human, it's a very different thing. Like you need to like trying to think, okay, what is the mental model that this human has of your product? Like, how do I convey the right way to think about the product to them? And I think that's a very hard thing to do. I think a lot about this like with like designing APIs and designing SDKs as well. It's a very hard thing because you're, like writing code for computers is kind of easy, but now you're actually writing code for a human. And so you need to think about like what their mental model is of your product and like how they would want to write the code. And so, and I don't know, like it's a little bit of a different mindset that I think is not as common in software. I don't know, that's like one of my theories for like why some of these things are very hard.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I agree. It's easy to just break it down rather than putting yourself in the mindset of others. And I guess like watching people sometimes, I don't know, like see.
I think it's really hard. It's like, I don't know, like I imagine like making music is very hard because like you keep hearing your own music, but then like you have to picture what does it sound like to a person who's hearing it for the first time? Like, I don't know. I just like to think about that as like kind of a weird analogy. Like, I don't know. It must be very hard.
True. And that's a good segue because you're bringing up music, and there's the Spotify connection. And I know that you were doing
That's right.
a ton of like data stuff throughout your whole career. So to kind of like step down a level, like how are you using data at Modal, and like are there any things that you found to be helpful?
It's funny. We actually don't use it that much. Like I don't know. Like to me, it's like data is always a tool, right? And like I'm like one like if you talk about like who cares about data, like who wants to build products in a data-driven way, I'm probably in like the top percentile. Like I'm obsessed with like using data when I can, but I'm also like to me it's just a tool, and like in some cases it's very hard to get the right data. Like we're early on. Like we don't necessarily have 100 million users, whatever, using us. Like the sort of we have a very small n of customers that use us. So we use data a lot, like internally, for like understanding like operational stuff, like understanding latency, understanding utilization, like stuff like that. But it's been hard so far to look at like the onboarding funnel and understand the conversion rates, and is it going up, is it going down? Because frankly, n is just not big enough. Which means like I think you have to be more qualitative. You have to kind of just like look at it. It's like it's like design, right? Like design, when you Google, like you can run an A/B test and try like different 55 different shades of blue. But if you're not Google and don't have 100 million users, you're just gonna have to use your own like preference, right? Like this blue looks better than this blue.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. That's great to hear, and I think probably like some people will find some reassurance there from you. But when you say like looking at qualitative data, like how has that been for you? Like, how are you looking?
A lot of it is like talking to customers, frankly, right? And that's so we can't necessarily be data driven, but we can talk to a lot of customers, and like we can get sort of qualitative data from customers, and I think that's very important to me, because you have to have a feedback loop. And one of the things I cared, I thought was very important for Modal is that even though it took us a year or maybe a year and a half to start having like substantial amount of like real users, like using us in production, we always try to put this in front of users. Initially, that was just like friends and like people I knew, and like I would demo this and like hear people's reaction. And I think it's very important to have those types of feedback loops. And one of the things is like people will generally like give you feedback, but it's often like kind of you have to like go a level beyond what they're saying. So it's trickier with like this human feedback. But like often you'll hear feedback like, oh, it would be really cool to be able to do X, but then they have to kind of think, okay, well, why are they trying to do X? And then maybe there's something else that would achieve the same purpose that's actually much simpler. So I try to do that a lot. Like I try to talk to a lot of customers. I try to listen to like what features they want to have from Modal, and then I kind of ignore that and try to understand like what do they actually want, and then build that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's, is it like the classic example of like people complaining about like how long the elevator takes, and then someone just put like a mirror, and then
yeah, something like that, right? Like
they're bored, basically.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, super interesting.
Should put a mirror in the Modal experience so you can see yourself.
I've always thought that, like, yeah, if you just put like a webcam, people wouldn't
exactly.
Yeah, like, except for the fact they're gonna have to like agree to display their webcam. But yeah.
But like here's like an example where like I think sort of illustrates the point I'm making, which is specific about waiting. Is that I think traditionally, like you talk to a lot of people, they want to have ability to run infrastructure locally.
Yeah.
But then like, why do they need that? Like, and that's like what I realized, like at some point I had this revelation that like, actually the reason why they want to have an ability to run things locally is because it's fucking slow to run things in the cloud. But what if we fix that instead? What if we actually make it fast? And so that's why I got obsessed with this. Like, okay, what if we actually make like running things in the cloud take a second? Now, actually, you don't need to have a local environment replicating an infrastructure environment. And things get so much easier because now we have just one environment that's running the same thing. That's an example of like how I think sometimes people like kind of vocalize like their problems, like they come up with solutions that are actually not the right solutions. You kind of have to look beyond.
Yeah, actually, like rogue question. When I did it, it was like super fast, and Is there any like kind of, do you ever have any issues when people just don't realize what you've done because it was so fast? Where it's like, like
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't. I think people realize it's still running in the cloud, right?
Yeah. Okay. If you had any advice for any founders listening, what would you share?
To me, the best advice, or like the like what I always like think, like again, like I think like advice is like very like, it has to be like reinterpreted, within the context of every company, because every company is different. But like personally, I always feel like the more I spend time on the core product and just like build like good stuff, the easier things get. Like I feel like the like advice today is like, you need to be out there like selling, you need to be out there like doing marketing. Like I actually didn't do that for like 2.5 years. Like now I'm like starting to do it. Like I just focus like all of my energy on like, let's just build a good product. And so, but validating that with real users, like what good it is, like you have to validate that. And so far, up until a few months ago, we were 12 people out of which 100% were software engineers. We were 100% software engineers until very recently. So that's like one thing where like I feel like I've gone a little bit against the grain, like just focusing on just like only hire software engineers. Everyone just builds the product, spend all the time just focusing on like building the absolute best product, and almost nothing like trying to market it. That's maybe like one of the things where I don't know, maybe I'll have to like, maybe I'll regret this in the future, but like so far that's been going pretty well for us.
Yeah, that's awesome. Actually, I think we've had some similar advice. It's not common, but some people have said this as well. So definitely seems to be a winning formula.
Yeah.
I guess there's a few. Yeah, that's awesome. So if people want to learn more about Modal, or if there's anything you want to share, Erik, let us know.
I mean, I think the best thing is to just try it out, right? Like go to modal.com, MODAL, play around with it. If you like it, that's awesome. If you don't like it, I would love to understand why. Like I'm always like curious to hear like feedback or whatever. I think the best way to like learn more about Modal is to try it out or read our docs, modal.com/docs.
Awesome. And very nice domain. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be back again soon.
Awesome. Thanks for hosting me.
Thanks, Erik.